All right. Welcome back to the study group. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Derek.
Welcome, everyone at home. In this episode, we're going to continue our three-part series on conflict mastery and how Jesus demonstrated that. And we're going to continue into the story of Jesus and the angry mob. Just a little background. Jesus was from Nazareth, where he encountered this angry mob who were zealots. They were kind of a little jealous of Jesus and a little bit wanting in political environments. Mm-hmm. So they were upset that Jesus, being from there, was not identifying with the political kind of revolutionary sect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was a lingering resentment from his later childhood, where they had asked him to join the Zealots and he had refused. So within the town, that there was a memory of that. And compounding that, in this situation, there were also what the book refers to as hirelings, who had actually been brought into the synagogue to cause trouble. And this was something that Jesus constantly had to deal with.
Trolls.
Trolls, yeah, big time trolls. And a lot of them were sent out by the Sanhedrin, sometimes ask difficult questions to try and entrap him or just to disrupt things. And, and that's part of what's going on here as well. So there's a complicated combination of factors that led to this resentment and anger against him. But some of it was just stirred up by ne'er-do-wells he constantly had to deal with. And he was very artful in doing that, as we'll see here eventually.
So here we go. Conflict Mastery Part 2, Jesus and the Angry Mob. Mm-hmm. So let me just start this story off and we'll go through it and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, and by the way, this was after he gave his sermon. So after he gave his sermon in the synagogue, it was traditional to step down and take questions from the people who were there. But instead of it just being a nice back and forth of conversation, he was being jostled and attacked. So we'll see how that works out.
Yeah, so like giving a presentation and then there's questions and answers afterwards. Mm-hmm. Okay. So Jesus found himself surrounded in the synagogue by a great throng of his enemies and a sprinkling of his own followers. They jostled him and, pointing accusing fingers at him, said, quote, "You think you are better than the people of Nazareth. We hear big things about you, but we notice that you do no wonders when you come back." So that's kind of a little bit of the growing animosity.
Yeah.
And then Jesus answered them, "I love the people who dwell in the city where I grew up. I would rejoice to see you all enter the kingdom of heaven. But the doing of the works of God is not for me to determine. The transformations of grace are wrought in response to the living faith of those who are the beneficiaries."
So that's kind of talking about why he's not done any miracles in Nazareth.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then he continues, it continues the story. Jesus would have good-naturedly managed the crowd and effectively disarmed even his violent enemies had it not been for the tactical blunder of one of his own apostles, Simon Zelotes, who, with the help of Nahor, one of the younger evangelists, had meanwhile gathered together a group of Jesus's friends from among the crowd and, assuming a belligerent attitude, had served notice on the enemies of the master to go hence. So basically, he rounded up a bunch of guys that were going to rough up these guys.
Yeah,
so it was an eye for an eye.
Yeah.
And I understand it. I get it. Like, you got someone that you love so much and you see them being berated by people. You don't think, oh, he's got this. You just think, I'm going to do what I got to do to save them from this material threat.
Yeah. So you can almost imagine this. It's almost cinematic when you think about this scene unfolding. And they go on to say that, I'm going to the next slide, Jesus had long taught the apostles that a soft answer turns away wrath. But his followers were not accustomed to seeing their beloved teacher, whom they so willingly called master, treated with such discourtesy and disdain. It was too much for them, and they found themselves giving expression to passionate and vehement resentment, all of which only tended to arouse the mob spirit in this ungodly and uncouth assembly.
It's getting out of control now.
Oh, yeah. I'll go to the next slide.
Okay.
Under the leadership of hirelings, these ruffians laid hold upon Jesus and rushed him out of the synagogue to the brow of a nearby precipitous hill, where they were minded to shove him over the edge to his death. But just as they were about to push him over the cliff, Jesus turned suddenly upon his captors and facing them quietly folded his arms. He said nothing, but his friends were more than astonished when, as he started to walk forward, the mob parted and permitted him to pass on unmolested. So this is really interesting on many levels. I mean, it's an example of Jesus, frame control, big time. And it's also doing something surprising and unexpected. So I can just add a little bit of this to this story, which is something I learned when I was in Israel at the Nazareth village. Our tour guide was a Messianic Jewish woman, meaning a follower of Jesus, Jewish, but a follower of Jesus. And she was incredibly informed about many things. And one of the things she explained about this incident is that what the mob was intending to do was tie Jesus' hands behind his back and then push him over head first onto the rocks. And that's how you could be sure that the person would die, because they couldn't break their fall. So when Jesus turned on the mob and folded his arms, they couldn't tie his arms behind his back.
Yeah.
And that sort of defeated that traditional thing that they
Plus, I can only imagine being such like a
and he was a big guy too.
He's just like folds his arms, like the body language in there is just like, I don't think so, kids.
Yeah, right.
And he's like, I'm gonna walk through you guys right now.
Right. So he definitely took command. Of the frame.
Talk about frame control. Yeah, I
totally.
love that. Yeah. All right, you want to continue?
Yeah. So then they draw this conclusion from the story, which I think is really interesting. They say that this turbulent ending of the third public preaching tour had a sobering effect upon all of Jesus's followers. They were beginning to realize the meaning of some of the master's teachings. They were awakening to the fact that the kingdom would come only through much sorrow and bitter disappointment. So it's so tempting to think that, I'm into being spiritual.
This is going to be
hearts and flowers and roses from here on out. But in this world, that's not the case.
Well, I always quote Bill Sadler Jr. on this one, where he had one of his recordings from Oklahoma where he says, well, let me ask you, were the apostles' lives easier after having known Jesus? Or was it more difficult? And he says, the spiritual lives, easier. It was simpler. But their temporal lives, no. Yeah. Not at all.
Yeah, right. And we know, of course, that several of the apostles were put to death after Jesus left. But some weren't. So there's a difference there. Not to say that the ones who were put to death weren't courageous in their speaking the truth and all of that. But this idea of a soft answer turning away wrath, this kind of gets us back to the idea of conflict mitigation. He tried to teach them and warn them about that and to tell them, look, if you can find your way through this without being put to death, then you can be around to teach another day.
Yeah. I think about the Apostle John.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how he took on such a kind vernacular.
Right.
My children, about love.
He lived to be what?
Even though younger John was a little bit more fired up.
Exactly. Right? Exactly.
But he took Jesus's wisdom and his guidance and his advice to heart.
Right. And others of the apostles that went completely into different areas, different parts of the world, and were able to not be put to death, at least not for a while. But this shows that there is enmity toward spirit on this planet.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a legacy of the rebellion. And it's something that all of us who want to try to teach these truths and bring spiritual enlightenment into our own lives and our communities, you kind of need to be aware of that and be artful in how we handle it.
Yeah.
To know when to be aggressive and forceful and when to mitigate with a soft answer.
Yeah, have some tact.
And tolerance and all of that. So it's probably a time for both. But
and I'd say like my big advice is like, don't worry about who knows. Like whatever you find that you have to do to mitigate these things and to help build the kingdom and push the Supreme forward, The angels know. Everyone knows. You don't need to announce it, and you don't need your opponent to recognize it.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
You have self-validation in here.
Right. And not to be afraid of the inevitable sorrows and disappointments that may come to pass. To understand that that's part of what goes on with this higher life, or being on a higher mission, if you want to put it in those terms.
Yeah, and I guess what a lot of this is calling upon is that we have the opportunity to call upon a higher mindset from Jesus. That we can, if our minds aren't serving us well, we have the opportunity to ask to change for the mind of Jesus, and let that be an operative for you too. Like, let that be an opportunity to grow in that experience of blending your mind, exchanging your mind for the mind of Jesus.
And having the mindfulness to remember that that's an option.
Yeah.
That's kind of the hard part. Sometimes at least, these situations come up and you just get caught up in it. You just want to fight it out, prove you're right or whatever that means. But that stopping and realizing that the Spirit of truth is there for us and will guide us. The Spirit of truth is referred to as a guiding influence. And that's part of, I think, how we do that exchange for the mind of Jesus is through this. It's sort of a surrender, but it's also an achievement and not a grasping, but a reaching. For this higher.
Another super additive type thing.
Yeah, it's a higher attitude of mind.
A higher standard, higher principles.
Yeah.
Usually.
Standards, principles, all of that.
Reflecting peace, mercy, generosity.
Loving your enemies, that whole idea. Yeah. Again, that fatherly.
So we can find that, our material minds might not serve us that well. We can go to Jesus, ask for guidance. Yeah. And then.
And that transcends our animal nature.
Right.
So when they say our material mind maybe not serving us, that's like our vestigial characteristics that come from our animal evolutionary origin. They come up very quickly inside of us, and we have to recognize when that happens if we want to express a higher truth or a higher reality that comes from Spirit. And that's there for us all the time. We just have to remember and
decisions. You got to choose.
You have to want that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope you guys want to come back to the next one. And this has been fun. Thanks, Chuck.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody
Eric.
at home. And we'll see you for the next one.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Where we'll talk about returning good for evil.
Exactly.
So we hope you return. Thanks.